So this is the last of this Contemporary China speaker series this year, but we've already lined up 2 speakers for next year, so we'll be back in October to do this again. But I see some regulars in the audience who we've had all year, so thanks for doing this. Hope it's been interesting. We appreciate the Harris School in particular, our partners there who do it with us, and I am delighted that we have Wendy Cutler here to close us out for the year, who's going to talk on trade. It's a very interesting time to be talking about trade generally, as well as trade with China. And I can't think of anyone better to do it than Wendy, who I've known a long time from Washington. She was the principal negotiator of the Korea U.S. Free Trade Agreement. She was really the key negotiator of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, that the United States has now pulled out of in the Trump administration. And more than just those negotiations is really, I would say, just about the most experienced U.S. trade negotiator of the last quarter century or so, serving 8 or 9 U.S. trade representatives and lots of presidents of both parties. From my vantage point, it's a great moment to talk about this because it's an inflection point, I think, for the United States on trade generally, where the politics of that are changing, but also an inflection point on trade with China. On the first, we did an event downtown this morning, and I was saying that, you know, when I went in the government and I got into the field of public policy, there were certain things I took for granted. One was that the U.S. was among the most open economies in the world and was proud of it and saw it as a comparative advantage and would always be committed to that. The second was that the U.S. as an architect of the multilateral trading system, both under the GATT system but also the WTO system, would remain deeply committed to the WTO system and trade multilateralism. Third, that the U.S. would really continue to be certainly a leader, if not the leader, on trade liberalization through bilateral and regional trade agreements. And last, that a lot of Americans, even though trade is always politically controversial, would basically look back to our roots as a trading country and say trade is a good thing for the United States. This is a net benefit. And we're at an inflection point where it's not always clear to me on a daily basis that we can make the presumption that the U.S. will be committed to any, or at least some combination of those things going forward. I think a lot depends on what happens over the next year or two and how the politics of some of this play out. So Wendy will talk a little bit about that. It's also an inflection point on China. We're a China-focused institute, the Paulson Institute. And, you know, we were talking about this a little bit before, Wendy and I, I think there's some assumptions we've made also about how China fit in with the U.S. I mean, one, as somebody who started as a national security person, but then has worked a lot on economics as well, I always assumed that economic integration would kind of mitigate security competition between the U.S. and China. And if you didn't assume that, then at least a lot of people made that presumption. But the U.S. and China are more economically integrated than ever. I mean, we do $600 billion plus in bilateral trade. The stock of U.S. investment in China now is about 50 billion, 60 billion or so. We have a product on our Paulson Institute think tank website, which is called Macro Polo, that looks at Chinese investment in the U.S. There are 113,000 Americans now working for Chinese-owned entities. There's about 55 billion contribution to the U.S. economy from Chinese direct investment in the U.S. So we're so intertwined, but not only is this not mitigating security competition, if anything, security competition is intensifying, and the underlying security clashes between the two sides are growing. And what's more, some of that security contestation is now bleeding into the economic relationship as well. And so I think we're heading for a very fundamental renegotiation of some of the pillars and presumptions of the relationship. And so this is an inflection point also over the next few years that's going to matter a lot. So in that context, we thought it would be great to close out the year by having Wendy come out, talk a little bit about what's happening on trade, in the way the U.S. and Washington in particular looks at the global economy, the world, how trade fits into that, and then also to talk a little bit about China. And you've provocatively titled this, Can we avert a trade war with China? So I don't know, but I guess we'll know soon enough. We're very casual here, so come up, talk, do your own Q&A, and we have a great audience. So everybody, let's welcome Wendy to the University of Chicago.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. We certainly are at an inflection point on trade. In particular, I would just say that trade more generally, I think it's safe to say in the past presidential campaign season, a lot of these assumptions about the benefits of trade were really being challenged by both parties. So my view is, regardless of who won the election, we were going to see changes in our trade policy. But if you had told me then that we would see all of the changes that we've seen to date, I would not have believed you. Just this week on trade, just three things I just bring to your attention. So number one, the NAFTA negotiations are at a very important juncture. The Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, has set the date of May 17th, which is Thursday, for the deadline for these negotiations, if indeed the agreement is going to get approved by this current Congress. Second, as we speak, at U.S. or in Washington, I don't know which building, a group of officials from different agencies are holding a public hearing, listening to concerns of stakeholders about the tariff increase product list of $50 billion that the U.S. has put forward under its 301 investigation of China's intellectual property protection practices. Those hearings, my understanding, will go on for about 3 days. Over 100 people are testifying, and thousands of comments have been received. And if that wasn't enough on trade this week, President Xi's closest economic advisor, Li He, is probably arriving Washington as we speak to continue negotiations with the United States on the prospects of reaching some kind of negotiated solution that hopefully could avert the need for tit-for-tat tariff exercise between the United States and China. So that's a lot going on. And then if you add on top of this that by June 1, the president needs to make important decisions on whether to impose permanent tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from a number of countries, including the European Union. So with all of that in mind, what I thought I would do today is just kind of give you kind of a broader context of my views on Trump trade policy, what's driving it, and how the outcomes reflected the rhetoric. I think that's important to understand in order to then move specifically to China to understand what's going on now. And then I'd really like to touch on the prospects for negotiated settlement and kind of offer some of my views, which may be useful, may not be. But I would say that I have negotiated trade agreements for 28 years with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. I've worked for 9 USTRs, both Republican and Democrat. And over those years, our trade policy was pretty consistent, basically in line with what Evan was saying. Opening markets was good. The U.S. was benefiting from open markets. And although there was different emphasis perhaps on different issues between Democratic and Republican administrations, overall it was a pretty consistent trade policy. And a lot of that has changed now with the Trump administration because they're calling into question a lot of things. So number one, their premise is, the president's premise is that the United States is losing from international trade. And in particular, the trade agreements that we've concluded have not benefited the United States. Other countries cheat, other countries continue to pursue unfair trade practices, and as a result, the U.S. on net is a loser. And the way he the way he demonstrates that is by pointing to our bilateral trade deficits with countries. Most economists will tell you that's not a good metric for assessing a trade relationship or assessing whether a country is pursuing fair or unfair trade practices. That has to do more with macroeconomic concerns. But for this president and his team, they're very focused on the bilateral trade deficit. And this becomes very important then when we move to our China discussion, because China's bilateral trade deficit by far is larger than any other country. Second, his view is that instead of negotiating on a multilateral or a plurilateral basis with a lot of countries, we should just negotiate bilaterally, that the U.S. will get a better deal in bilateral negotiations. I think part of this is based on his premise that as a real estate negotiator, he was able to get better deals one-on-one with another country. In reality, though, the United States, before the Trump administration, we were moving towards regional plurilateral agreements, the idea being that, number one, you get a bigger bang for your buck if you negotiate with more countries. The impact is greater. But second, that's the way business is conducted these days, that very little trade just now moves between country A and country B. Then in reality, products move to a number of countries in what we call supply chains, and therefore, for a trade agreement really to be useful to our businesses, it makes much more sense to have a group of countries all following the same rules and being held to the same standards. Third, I would just say that he's brought the word reciprocity back to the forefront. This was a word that we used in the old U.S.-Japan trade war days, and now you'll hear a lot about reciprocity, and that is basically we treat you like you treat us. Your market's closed, we're going to close our market. Your telecommunications sector is closed, we're going to close ours. And so you'll hear a lot of talk about what they call fair and reciprocal trade. And then I would also say it's very transactional these days, that there doesn't seem, in my mind, to kind of be a coherent trade policy. You think there is, and then something is said, and some deal is made, or some issue is resolved in a way, and it seems to be very kind of what's on their plate at the current moment. What can you get for this concession? How valuable is this concession? And let's do the deal. And that's kind of a new phenomenon in Washington on the trade front. So in terms of, like, when you look now a year and a half into the administration, we've heard a lot of tough talk and hardline talk from President Trump and his trade team. But in reality, when you look at the outcomes, they're not as hardline. And frankly, they have a very kind of, mixed review in my mind. Number one, he withdrew from TPP. That was the third day of his administration. I personally worked on TPP for many years. Even if I didn't, I would have thought it was a serious mistake. I would say that was something he did quickly. TPP kind of became the poster child in the presidential election of everything that was bad with trade. So it wasn't surprising. However, it did surprise a lot of our trading partners, because I think even though they knew there was a growing sentiment against trade and against TPP in the United States, I think they had a hard time realizing how the United States could walk away from a deal that provided so many benefits to the U.S. and was largely based on U.S. proposals that were put forward. But after TPP, then, he did not enter into new market opening negotiations. The view was, we need to fix existing agreements. And so the focus was largely on fixing the North America Free Trade Area negotiations, NAFTA. As I mentioned, these negotiations are reaching an important juncture this week. And he also went to Korea and insisted on renegotiating the U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement. Now, in both of these agreements, during the negotiations, he threatened to withdraw from the agreement, to walk away from the agreement. And through his trade policy, you see a lot of threats and a lot of rhetoric and a lot of threats about he's going to impose these sanctions, he's going to withdraw from this agreement, a lot of disruption. But in reality, a lot of that has not taken place. He has launched a lot of investigations under various U.S. trade laws, and we'll get to those in a minute. And he's also really questioned the value of the World Trade Organization and whether the WTO is really an organization that is meaningful and relevant in this current time. I think one of the reasons why he has backed off on a number of what I would call hardline outcomes is that he's facing, and not just him, but any administration, really faces a number of constraints when it comes to trade policy. And these constraints, I would just highlight 4 of them. The first is Congress, and under our Constitution, Congress has the authority to regulate trade. And over the years, Congress has delegated authority to the executive branch. But Congress plays a very important role in trade policy. Most notably, it has to approve the deals that are brought home at the end of the day. And so Congress does have a voice, and an important voice, in the deals and how they are shaped. Second, I think another constraint or a complication that the president has faced with his trade agenda is that trade, and taking any trade decision or making any decision on a negotiation, any president, any administration is faced with a lot of trade-offs between their workers and businesses. That if you're trying to, for example, to save a steel job, that may be at the expense of an auto job, an industry that uses steel. If you want to retaliate against China, and even if you limit your list to manufactured products, nothing stops China or another country from coming back and putting forward a list with agricultural products. And so, once again, there's a trade-off. Third, trade agreements, trade negotiations, trade actions have effect on the markets and our overall economy and the global economy. And as we know, the president does watch the markets very closely. And four, you don't have control over your trading partner. And I think this administration came in and thought mistakenly that they had a lot of leverage in these trade negotiations with other countries. And I'm not saying that the United States doesn't have leverage. I think that they overestimated the leverage that they have at the negotiating table. And I think NAFTA is a case in point. When the administration started, they thought that they could conclude the NAFTA negotiations within a few months. They thought that they could basically tell Mexico what it needed to do, and Canada, we were so aligned with Canada on these issues that Canada wouldn't be a problem. Well, needless to say, 9 months later, we're still kind of in a very kind of difficult and tough negotiation with our two closest neighbors. So now when we get to China, I mentioned deficit. So the president's focused on the bilateral trade deficit, and it's not just the general deficit, it's not just the trade deficit, it's the goods trade deficit. And for whatever reason, he doesn't include services when he talks about our trade deficit. So when we look at our deficit with China on goods, it's about $375 billion. This is huge. This is really big. When you look at our next 10 trading partners, I think combined, or the next 9, are about 3/4 the amount of the China trade deficit. We've seen in his trade policy towards China kind of 2 phases. I think the first phase, when he first came in, even though he talked tough about China, he didn't name China currency manipulator, but he also established a dialogue for interaction with China, which had 4 different pillars. I can't remember all of them now, but on the economic front, he established this CED, the Comprehensive Economic Dialogue, and those negotiations were basically led by Wilbur Ross. But by July, those negotiations were basically called off, and we've then entered a period where Ambassador Lighthizer seemed to kind of get the spotlight on the China issues, who quickly then launched a Section 301 investigation into China's unfair trade practices with respect to intellectual property and what is called forced technology transfer. In addition, he launched a number of other trade actions and trade investigations through different trade laws. And I thought here I would just highlight 3 sets of trade actions that are being undertaken under different U.S. laws but are somehow all conflated. The first is Section 201, which is our safeguards law, which is also reflected in the WTO. And there, in January, in response to petitions filed by U.S. private sector interests, the administration imposed tariffs both on solar panels but also on washing machines. And in both of these products, China exported goods to us. China soon after announced an anti-dumping investigation against U.S. imports of sorghum. Some people believe, including me, that this announcement was just too coincidentally timed with the 201 action to suggest that they had nothing to do with each other. And these tariffs on sorghum imports were applied by China about a month ago. Second, there are what we call the Section 232 tariffs in place. Those have to do, this Section 232 allows the president to restrict imports based on national security considerations. And he launched an investigation on steel and aluminum imports into the United States. And in March, he imposed tariffs against China, Russia, Japan, and others. And a few weeks later, China responded by imposing their own tariffs against the U.S., valued at $3 billion. And then finally, and this is really probably the most important trade action that's hasn't taken place yet, but is in process, and that is the Section 301 investigation that I mentioned. And here, there are three aspects to this Section 301 announcement. The first was that the president was going to impose tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese trade with China, Chinese imports. And he put forward a list of a series of products that, once again, is now subject to a public hearing as we speak. He also announced the initiation of a WTO case against China, looking at its discriminatory licensing procedures. And third, he announced that investment restrictions will be forthcoming, and they're due to the president next week. And those would be, from what I understand, if indeed they come out, would deal with imposing restrictions on Chinese investment that mirror restrictions China's putting on U.S. investment in China. So right now, these threats are out there with respect to 301. The tariffs have not gone into effect. We've also seen a number of other measures and announcements, including the consideration of legislation to tighten and expand CFIUS, that is to deal with looking at investment applications in the United States for national security reasons, and there the Congress is taking the lead. We've seen the imposition, and this became a big issue last Sunday up until now, sanctions that were announced by the Commerce Department against ZTE. And we've also heard that China's beginning to harass some of U.S. imports at the border, including cars, porks, and fruit, by conducting more inspections, more rigorous inspections. And so all of this is taking place, but there is a prospect for a negotiated solution with a high-level group of cabinet officials who went over to China just last week. And here, it was very interesting. It's very unusual to see 5 U.S. cabinet officials go on a trade meeting to another country. That's what happened. And I think that, number one, underscores the importance this administration is attaching to the China issue. But I also think it was a desire by kind of all the cabinet officers wanting to be in the mix on the important issue of China trade. At the formal meeting, my sense is not a whole lot happened. And during that time, the U.S. put forward a proposal to China, which in my mind really represented kind of a grab bag of every problem that has been raised in the administration with China on the trade front, including asking China to decrease its bilateral trade deficit with us by $200 billion. It also asked China to reduce its tariffs on certain products in line with the level of U.S. tariffs, including autos, but other products as well. It called on China to open its investment regime, to get rid of its subsidies under China Made in 2025 program. Also asked for the opening of the services market, et cetera. And then it also went as far as to ask China to give up its right to retaliate against the U.S. or to take a WTO case against the U.S. which in my mind, I've never seen a proposal that had that last element in it. I think that went pretty far. China responded with its own proposal, and my sense is, from what I understand, that was also pretty extreme and pretty hardline. So if you look just at these proposals, it was hard to see how differences could be bridged. But what we have seen now is that there is talk about a deal with President Xi, President Xi's closest economic advisor, Li He, coming to Washington for about 5 days of talks with Secretary Mnuchin and others. With respect to these negotiations, I would offer a few observations. Number one, these are very high-stakes negotiations. When you have in the offing all of these threatened tariff increases and the implications of these tariff increases for each country, this is a very serious negotiation. And I do believe both China and the U.S. have a shared interest in trying to do everything they can to prevent this tit-for-tat trade war from taking place. Second, another observation, I think it's very important for successful negotiation for the U.S. or any other trading partner who's the demander to make sure the other side has an idea of your priorities. And I don't view the U.S. proposal to China as successful in that regard. I think it included so many issues and would require China to do so many things that it probably left China kind of at a loss of what does it need to do, because even if it focused on one area, was that even important in the larger scheme of things? And so hopefully there are discussions going on where priorities are being discussed. Third, and this I think is very important, particularly what we're hearing about what may happen over the next 5 days, I think it's very important, given that we are on the brink of a trade war and it's taken a while to get here, and there are very serious differences in views and perspectives on the China trade issue, that I think it's important, particularly for the U.S. administration, but also for China, not to be tempted by making kind of short-term, immediate deals. Such deals may be politically expedient, but they don't solve a lot of the underlying issues, which will continue to fester and we'll have to deal with at some point. I think it's important that each country knows their red lines, and there I mean what it just absolutely can't and won't do, and before it presents those red lines to the other country, that it seriously considers them in its own internal process. And I think for this administration, I think they're kind of going to have one shot at this China trade issue. That I think once if and when they do a deal on this China trade issue, it should be a good and meaningful deal, because it'll be very hard to have the credibility to go to the brink of a trade war a year or two from now if things aren't going well. And finally, I think it's very important for this administration to consult very closely with Congress and stakeholders and our other trading partners throughout this process. And I'm going to get to our other trading partners later on. So I mentioned, and just in terms of the deal itself, there are a lot of issues on the table, and there are issues that are easier to deal with than others. I think for China, it'd be easier to maybe deal with the deficit reduction issue, because that would require China to buy more from the United States. I think that is possible. Some of the numbers that are out there are pretty large, but I think it's easier for China to buy more rather than to make kind of or respond to some of the underlying structural requests that the United States has raised. China has also, in the past few months, mentioned a number of what I would call kind of piecemeal things that it could do for the United States and other trading partners, such as reducing its auto tariff, such as opening its financial services market. And I think it'll be tempting to embrace these as part of the package. I think it's okay, but I don't think that once again, the combination of some piecemeal market opening with tariff reduction is the way to go. From my mind, once again, if you're going to go this far towards a trade war, then you should try and get a meaningful and long-lasting result. So what I would, if I were counseling USTR right now in the administration, I would just say, fine, ask for some deficit reduction, ask for some piecemeal reforms, but really put the focus on trying to deal with what we call these structural, deep-seated issues. And here I would look to not only the Made in China 2025 sectors, but also sectors like semiconductors and other sectors where China is heavily subsidizing and providing important financial assistance to its companies. And here, I don't think the United States should ask for China to dismantle its China 2025 policies. Countries have the right to pursue industrial policies, but only up to a point. And here I think that the magnitude of what China is doing is of great concern, and the impact of what China is doing on the global trading system, on its global competitors, I think is something that it's okay and it's legitimate for the United States to put requests on the table. So here I would suggest issues like having China provide full disclosure of the level and the types of subsidies, financial assistance, and other assistance it's giving its firms is legitimate to ask for. I think the U.S. should ask for non-discriminatory access to this financing for U.S. companies in China. And then I think it would be, and it's legitimate to ask for discussions on how the global implications, the trade implications, can be mitigated. In a lot of these sectors, if China is successful, pours a lot of monies into these sectors, and their companies become global competitors, they are also, we face a problem where we may see huge overcapacity in the international market and make it very difficult for companies that don't get such support to compete against Chinese firms. So I think these are the kinds of issues they should be talking about, because I fear if they don't, we're really headed towards even more friction as we look ahead. And I think it's very important to have some kind of what I would call kind of a regular kind of monitoring, enforcement, benchmark type of arrangement in any agreement with China to make sure that China lives up to its obligations. I would just conclude my remarks by briefly then touching upon the importance of working with other countries. And I think here, China is doing a great job at this. China is traveling, its diplomats are traveling around the world. It's meeting with its ambassadors in Beijing, trying to explain its position, trying to seek support for its position on these issues. But the United States isn't doing a terribly good job. I'm not saying it's not doing anything, but my experience has shown, not just with China, but with other countries as well, that your chances of success are increased when you work with a coalition of other countries. The countries don't like just to answer to one country, even if it's the United States. But if it's a group of countries and they're presenting a trading partner with evidence and concerns, the other trading partner tends to be more receptive. And so, in my mind, what this administration should have done is put a lot of premium on doing that work with other like-minded countries even before it launched a lot of its trade actions, particularly the Section 232 steel trade action, where we, the United States, we are threatening retaliation and tariffs against a lot of our allies and friends at a time when we're also asking some of them to support us on our position on China trade. And I think that's very difficult for them to grapple with. And so I'm going to just conclude on that note and just say, I think the next 5 days of these negotiations between the U.S. and China are going to be very important. I hope that both sides can work together to find a way to avert the imposition of tariffs. But once again, I really hope that the fact that we've gone this far, that both sides really take the time to work on and draft a really meaningful and kind of an enduring deal that will prevent conflicts in the future. So that's it.
Thank you for your talk. So I have a question about the the thoughts about the two countries between U.S. and China. So I think in this situation that for a very long time, the United States and China both think they are the loser in the trade between these two countries. So like for the United States, like Trump has said, he says that he's been beaten or like bullied for the past decades by China or Japan or many other countries in the world. And for China, it's like, because based on our view, it's like for the past decades, our major economic advantage is about our labor cost, is that we cost less than the Western countries. And apparently in the recent 10 years, our advantage are declining dramatically, especially compared to India or Southeast Asia. And so I think the 2025 or the One Belt, One Road policy are both to help China to climb to the next phase before our advantage decline to nothing. So both countries think they're loser in this situation. So how can that be? Do you have any like experience about that feeling?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of times I would negotiate with countries, and you have your kind of preconceived notions, right? Because you think the way you see it is the way they see it, but a lot of times the way they see it is just very different. And like what you just said, like a lot of ways, maybe China is viewing the fact that it's losing its competitive advantage in a lot of industries because it cannot produce these goods as cheaply as a Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos or India. And they have a desire to move up the value chain. And so one thing I always learned in negotiations, probably when people ask me, like, what's the most important skill in negotiations? It's really listening to the other country. And once you can kind of put yourself in their shoes, I think you have it's easier to come up with some understandings and agreements with them, because I think it is important to understand how they see things. And a lot of times they see things very differently than not only you see the things, but that you think that you have just misconceptions about how they view themselves and their own position. So I think by listening to the types, these different perspectives is very important in negotiations.
I'm curious about to what extent the Democratic administration would be on board with the policies that the Trump administration is having now, and to what extent it's related to the increasing strategic concern about China's rise, both economically and militarily. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that question because who knows? But I do think that any Democratic administration would also be concerned with China. We have serious problems with China and serious differences. I'm working for the Obama administration. I saw that firsthand. And so I think the issues would be there, the concerns would be there. The question is, I think approaches might be different. And when it came, to President Obama's approach, for example, his view was, well, when China's not behaving by the rules, let's take them to the WTO, to the World Trade Organization. And under the Obama administration, an unprecedented number of dispute settlement cases were sent to the WTO. While the Trump administration, their view is, no, we don't think the WTO works, and we don't think the WTO really addresses the kinds of issues we have with China. So therefore, we're going to dust off our old trade laws and go back to kind of the approaches we used in the 80s against Japan, which include, raising tariffs, using Section 301, and using some of these other trade statutes. But once again, I do think it's really, there may be a difference in approach, but I think the underlying concerns are really shared, on both sides of the aisle in Congress, and frankly, probably would have been shared by any Democratic administration that came into office as well.
One of the questions I have to ask is that historically, the country, from the founding fathers, has always had an industrial policy, and it wasn't until the 80s that we really sort of threw the industrial policy out the window in an effort to build, the GATT and then the World Trade Consortium. And my question is there any future in this country for industrial policy, and especially vis-a-vis the World Trade Organization?
Well, Hang on a second. Some of our trading partners think we still have an industrial policy. You know, for example, we bailed out, our car companies, and a lot of people think that a lot of the money we give to our Defense Department helps nurture our aerospace industries and other industries. So once again, I don't think it's the industrial policy itself. It's really how big it is and what kind of distortions it can make, and how difficult it is to compete against a company that's getting a lot of state backing if you're a private company. And so that's what I was trying to get at before. I think you can come up with rules to help level that playing field and to make sure that the industrial policies, they can stay in place, but that they're regulated in a way that don't distort the international trading system.
Part of the idea of the TPP was to use the bargaining leverage that a large trade group would have as an inducement that China could accede to it if it made structural changes. Well, Trump abandoned that idea, but I wonder whether if the Trump administration seeks to impose sanctions on Iran, that provides an occasion for people opposed to that, and that might include not only Iran, but China and the European Union, to establish something that would be like a counter along the analogous to the TPP, but a regime that sought to provide leverage against the United States to prevent the United States from using financial controls and other leverage against autocratic regimes.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting kind of combination of issues. You know, let me just comment on the TPP. First of all, the TPP wasn't like a U.S. plot to contain China. And I always remind people, the United States wasn't even one of the original members of TPP. We had to be invited into TPP as well. The idea was more premised upon the notion that the World Trade Organization basically had lost its way with respect to being a negotiating forum. And so like-minded countries, countries who wanted to do more, to do WTO plus rules, they got together, and over time, more and more countries joined until we got to 12 countries, with the United States joining, midway in the United States, once again, being invited to join. But another part of the hope of TPP, the view, the vision of TPP, was to create kind of the rules, the future rules for trade in the Asia-Pacific, to kind of present an alternative model to maybe what a China model of trade would look like. But it wasn't anti-China. And so there were rules in areas like state-owned enterprises, which once again didn't say, the text on state-owned enterprises did not say you have to dismantle your state-owned enterprises. What it said, if you have them and they compete in the commercial space, these are the rules they should follow. And the hope was, over time, after the 12 countries concluded TPP, that other countries would join, and maybe eventually China would join. And it was interesting. I left USTR right after the TPP negotiations, and one of my first trips, I'm now with the Asia Society, was to Beijing. And when I arrived in Beijing, during all my meetings with government people and private sector people and think tank people, everyone wanted to talk TPP, and it wasn't just at a very high level. People were asking me like specific questions about specific provisions in the labor chapter, in the state-owned enterprise chapter, trying to kind of understand what the obligation meant. But also what I kind of concluded was kind of trying to figure out if at some point China wanted to join, what this would mean for China. And then, regrettably, the United States, we couldn't move quickly enough in Congress. The presidential campaign made TPP kind of the poster child for everything that was bad on trade, and then President Trump withdrew. But what's interesting, and I think this gets to what your point in Iran, is that, so the U.S. withdrew. a number of the other 11 countries in the deal, they started talking about maybe we should try and do this without the United States. And they started those discussions, and their first meeting was in Chile, and at that time they even invited Korea and China to that meeting. And I remember people telling me about the meeting and it was going to happen, and I was very skeptical that the other countries could do this without the United States, that they would be willing to, still agree to the types of rules that we had negotiated, and that also without the U.S. market access, whether they could even sell the deal with us at home and gain the support they needed. But over time, it was very interesting. The 11 countries, they worked together well. They figured out how to conclude this deal without us, and indeed, they did conclude it without us. And that deal, the TPP-11 deal, is scheduled to go into effect in the beginning of next year. And not only did they do this deal, which I think is amazing, but they kept most of the provisions that were negotiated in the original TPP intact, and they kept all the market access, meaning all the tariff cuts, intact. They weren't changed. And so people talk about all these big changes that were made to that deal, but if you look at the overall TPP, very few changes were made to this deal, and this deal will come into effect. And I think the hope for the other 11 countries is that the United States eventually will come back. But in the meantime, they're going to court other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia and maybe Latin America, to join.
What's going on with Trump's recent moves on ZTE, and do you view this as a positive development?
So on Sunday, I got an email from a reporter wanting me to know if I wanted to comment on President Trump's tweet on ZTE. And I have to say, the first time I read it, I thought it was a joke, okay? Because it just seems so out of character. Just talk to President Xi, or President Xi and I are going to work to get ZTE back into business so we can basically help save Chinese jobs. I mean, I know I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that's kind of what it said. Not much. My first thing was when I heard Chinese jobs, I'm like, no, he meant U.S. jobs. And then so I called this reporter, no, he meant Chinese jobs. And so, so this is kind of part of that unpredictability, and maybe it's part of whoever is the last person you talk to. But I was very surprised by this. And, just to back up for people, you all know the ZTE company, but with ZTE was found in violation of U.S. sanctions laws, basically by selling its equipment with U.S. chips and software to some sanctioned countries, including Iran and North Korea. And then it had sanctions on it already, but then not agreeing to what it agreed to do in order to lessen those sanctions. And so now this whole issue of ZTE appears to be on the negotiating table. Now, some people are horrified in the United States because they view this as an enforcement action, which should not be subject to negotiation. If you violate a U.S. trade law, you get punished, and it shouldn't be a negotiating chit or something that you can negotiate. Okay, but once you get over that, it is on the table, and I think it's something that probably China's made it very clear that this is really critical for them if they're going to even discuss the prospects of any negotiated solution with the United States. My view, though, as a trade negotiator at heart, I think it's something that is very, very important to China. And to the extent that the United States is going to negotiate some lesser sanction against ZTE, I just hope they get paid a lot for it, because I think it's worth a lot to China.
I would be really interested to hear you talk about the retail politics of trade. So you live in Washington, you were a trade negotiator, you worked with other governments, but presumably while you were a trade negotiator, you went out around the country and had to talk to real Americans about real trade issues. When I moved here to Chicago from DC in 2011, I would talk about things like TPP. And people would say, that's the worst. This was even pre-Trump, pre-election. That's the worst thing ever. That TPP, elites, pro-corporates. So there's that.
Right.
But then also when you get out around communities in the Midwest, there are communities that are touched by foreign investment. People work for foreign companies. Toyota in Indiana, sometimes Chinese companies. So people have complicated views around investment. The big abstract deals seem abstract, and so people can't relate to it, they don't like them. But the local things that they can touch, it introduces more complexity and nuance into the way they understand foreign trade and foreign investment. So I'd be interested in how it convinced me that trade is a very retail subject. You have to talk to people about it in ways that make sense in terms of their lives, their economic futures, their business. And I'd be curious how you see that evolving in the U.S. Is that getting harder? Is it just becoming more diverse because sectors are fragmenting that are touched by trade? How do you make the case for trade in a non-Washington context to Americans amid so much diversity?
You know, first of all, I think all previous administrations have failed miserably at conveying the benefits of trade and really getting folks to support the trade deals that we've done. And efforts have been made, and I can't tell you how many meetings I've participated in during my career on the need to do a better job in explaining the benefits of trade. And a lot of meetings with the private sector as well, because that's a lot of their responsibility, you know, because it's the extent they benefit from trade. And what I always found was that the more you could come up with concrete stories about, you know, a small U.S. business that's employing people who are making goods to export, let's say, to Korea under the U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement, that resonated so much more than saying, oh, you know, some macroeconomic figures about, you know, this will increase our GDP growth rate by 0.8% and blah, 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 blah. But it's hard to get those stories, and it's hard to kind of mobilize even the workers for companies that are benefiting from trade. And so my view on trade, I think those efforts have to continue. A better job needs to be done. But I also think that we shouldn't fool ourselves, because the losers of trade, and here I would also say that more and more people like to blame trade for a lot of the effects they're feeling from globalization, being left behind, and trade somehow has taken on you know, a lot of the criticism, and I think unfairly so. In fact, if you look at a lot of the jobs that are going to be lost looking ahead, many more are going to be lost to automation, productivity, technological developments. And that's all getting kind of conflated, and people just blame trade for this. And so I think that piece of information needs to be conveyed as well. But frankly, I just think we need to do a better job on the domestic front, taking care of those who have been left behind. And it's hard for me to see how this country is going to kind of, will ever be able to regain kind of bipartisan support for trade without having a robust domestic program to take care of those, to help those who've been left behind, and to educate our kids for the jobs of the future. That those kind of programs need to go hand in hand with any you know, any future market opening kind of campaign.
When we talk about the benefits of trade, one of the big benefits is that arguably hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of dire poverty across the world. Does this count for anything, or do we talk about our benefits of trade being limited to our borders?
Well, now we do. But you know, once again, you know, we use that information, and you know, but it's very hard to convey that. It's very hard to relate to that. The numbers are so big, people, you know, they don't understand that. I think, you know, I would have bosses who would go to Africa and like just go to one village and just be able to see like 10 women who are now able to have a business and to, you know, sell their goods to other countries in Africa, and thanking, you know, the U.S. for helping make this happen. And to me, that's how you increase support and you increase education on the benefits of trade. That the more you can bring it home to specific examples, the more you can show the business, the worker, the student, whatever it is, the more successful you can be. But all of that said, the people who are left behind are always going to be more vocal. The media is always going to put the spotlight on them, right? It's not a great story, the story that, oh, this person's doing great because of trade. The other story is always more compelling on the front page of the paper. And that's kind of, that's a hard nut to crack.
Hey, Wendy, thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you.